In 1884, a massive castle-like structure stood alone on Central Park West, surrounded by shanties, goat pastures, and empty lots. Critics looked at this strange fortress rising from the Manhattan wilderness and called it madness. They called it Clark's Folly. Within a decade, every apartment was occupied. There was a waiting list to get in, and the building that skeptics mocked had become the most coveted address in New York City. This is the story of the Dakota, the first luxury apartment building in America. A place that convinced wealthy New Yorkers to abandon their private mansions and live under one roof with strangers. It took a peculiar combination of scandal, vision, and an unlikely fortune to make it happen. The money came from sewing machines, from a partnership between a notorious womanizer whose personal life would scandalize the nation and a cautious lawyer who saw the future of American living. One man created chaos wherever he went. The other built an empire from the wreckage. Together, their fortune would reshape how the American elite chose to live. The Dakota has witnessed nearly a century and a half of New York history. Gilded Age bankers raised families within its walls. Hollywood discovered its Gothic mystery. Artists and musicians made it their sanctuary. And on a December night in 1980, the world watched in horror as one of music's greatest icons was gunned down in its archway. If you find this story fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to support the channel. It means a lot. And I also welcome you to share your opinions in the comments below. The Dakota began as an insult, a joke about a building so far from civilization it might as well be in the Western Territories. But Edward Clark, the man who built it, would have the last laugh. His folly became a legend. The fortune that built the Dakota came from one of the most scandalous men in 19th century America. Isaac Merritt Singer was tall, handsome, and utterly without conscience. He maintained 4 separate families simultaneously in Manhattan, each unaware of the others. He fathered at least 24 children with 5 different women, and he happened to revolutionize the sewing machine industry along the way. Singer was born in 1811 in upstate New York. He left home at 12 years old with almost no education and a burning desire to become a famous actor. For nearly 2 decades, he wandered the country with traveling theater troupes. The performances rarely paid well, but Singer discovered he had other talents. He was charming, he was persuasive, and he had a gift for mechanical invention. By 1850, Singer was working in a Boston machine shop when his employer asked him to repair a Lero and Blahit sewing machine. Singer studied the device and realized he could build something better. Within 11 days, reportedly working 18 to 20 hours at a stretch, he had constructed a prototype that would change the world. His machine could sew continuously on any part of a garment. It could handle curves, not just straight lines. A skilled operator could produce 900 stitches per minute. Nothing like it had ever existed. Singer secured a patent in August of 1851, and a new industry was born. But Singer was not a businessman. He was an actor who happened to invent things. He needed a partner who understood money, contracts, and the brutal realities of commerce. He found that partner in Edward Clark. Clark was everything Singer was not. Born in 1811, the same year as Singer, he had trained as a lawyer and built a respectable practice in upstate New York. He was careful, conservative, and utterly devoted to order. He married once to Caroline Jordan and remained faithful to her until her death. Where Singer created chaos, Clark created structure. The two men formed I Am Singer and Company in 1851. Their partnership was contentious from the start. They disagreed on nearly everything, but they needed each other. Singer had the invention, Clark had the business acumen, and Clark proved to be one of the most innovative marketers of his generation. It was Clark who created America's first installment payment plan. Sewing machines cost over $100 at a time when the average family earned perhaps $500 per year. Nobody could afford such a luxury. Clark's solution was revolutionary. He allowed customers to pay a small amount each month until the machine was theirs. Suddenly, middle-class housewives could own Singer sewing machines. Sales exploded. While Clark built the business, Singer built families. His legal wife, Catherine Maria Haley, had borne him 2 children before he abandoned her. He then established a household with Mary Ann Spencer, who believed herself to be his wife and gave him 10 children. Simultaneously, he was involved with Mary McGonigal, who bore him 5 more children under the assumed family name of Matthews. There were others as well. Singer moved between these households with astonishing audacity, somehow keeping them ignorant of one another for years. The arrangement collapsed spectacularly in 1860. Mary Ann Spencer spotted Singer driving down Fifth Avenue in an open carriage. Seated beside him was Mary McGonigal. The confrontation that followed made headlines across the city. When investigators began looking into Singer's domestic arrangements, they discovered the full scope of his deception. 4 families in Manhattan alone, at least 16 children. The scandal was enormous. Accused of bigamy and adultery, Singer fled to England. There he met Isabella Eugenia Burr, a 19-year-old French woman of striking beauty. Some historians believe she later served as the model for the Statue of Liberty, though this remains disputed. Singer married her in 1863, and they produced 6 more children together. Singer never returned to live in America. He constructed an enormous estate in England called the Wigwam, reportedly one of the largest private homes in the country at that time. He died there in July of 1875, leaving behind a fortune of approximately $13 million. In today's currency, that would be equivalent to over $300 million. His will divided the money among 20 of his surviving children, though not equally. One son, who had supported his mother during her divorce proceedings, received only $500. Even in death, Singer played favorites among the families he had created and abandoned. Edward Clark emerged from this chaos with control of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He had spent 2 decades managing the business, while Singer lived flamboyantly and irresponsibly. Now the fortune was effectively his. Clark was 64 years old, one of the wealthiest men in America, and ready for a new venture. He turned his attention to real estate, specifically to a radical idea that would challenge everything wealthy New Yorkers believed about how respectable people should live. Clark was about to build an apartment house, not for the working class, not for immigrants crammed into tenements, for the rich, for families who currently lived in private mansions, with servants and carriages, and all the trappings of Gilded Age wealth. Everyone told him it was impossible. The wealthy would never consent to live beside strangers. They would never ride elevators with their neighbors. They would never abandon the privacy and prestige of owning their own homes. Clark listened to the skeptics. Then he bought land on the most remote stretch of Manhattan he could find, and he began to build. In the 1870s, respectable New Yorkers did not live in apartments. Apartments were for immigrants, for the working poor, for families crammed into the cramped, airless tenements of the Lower East Side. The wealthy lived in private homes, townhouses along Fifth Avenue, mansions with servants' quarters, and carriage houses. To suggest that a banker or railroad president might share a roof with strangers was unthinkable. Edward Clark saw things differently. Clark had watched the cities of Europe for years. In Paris, in London, in Vienna, wealthy families occupied grand apartment buildings without any loss of social standing. They enjoyed shared courtyards, communal services, and the convenience of urban living. Why should New York be different? The city was growing rapidly. Land values were climbing. Maintaining a private mansion required enormous expense and constant attention. Surely there was a market for something new. Others had already tested the concept. In 1869, a building called the Stasant had opened on East 18th Street. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, it offered respectable middle-class families a new way to live. The apartments were modest but comfortable. The Stasant proved successful enough to inspire imitators, but it catered to professionals and merchants. Nobody had yet attempted to lure the truly wealthy away from their mansions. Clark decided to experiment on a small scale first. In 1879, he commissioned architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg to design an apartment building called the Vancia on 7th Avenue near 55th Street. The structure cost approximately $8,000 per unit to construct. It attracted solid, respectable tenants. But Clark wanted something grander, something that would prove once and for all that luxury apartment living could work in America. The site he selected made observers question his judgment. In 1880, the Upper West Side was not a fashionable neighborhood. It was barely a neighborhood at all. The land west of Central Park remained largely undeveloped. Contemporary visitors described a landscape of rocky outcrops, scattered wooden structures, and acre after acre of open ground stretching toward the Hudson River. The few buildings that existed were modest at best. Some plots reportedly still functioned as small farms or pasture land. The contrast with the Upper East Side could not have been more stark. East of Central Park, elegant townhouses lined the avenues. The wealthy had flocked there as soon as the park opened in the 1860s, but the West Side, with its steeper terrain and lack of amenities, had attracted almost no investment. Land was cheap precisely because nobody wanted it. Clark purchased a plot at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue, which would later be renamed Central Park West. The site covered approximately 41,000 square feet. The location offered certain advantages. 72nd Street was one of the wider crosstown roads, measuring 100 feet across. The plot sat on a slight rise, offering views across much of the island, and Central Park itself lay directly to the east. But these advantages meant nothing to skeptics. The distance from fashionable society seemed insurmountable. New York's social and commercial life centered far to the south and east. The Upper West Side felt like another world entirely. Critics took to calling Clark's project his folly. The nickname that had circulated as a joke in the introduction to this story became a persistent taunt as construction progressed. The name Dakota emerged during this period as well. Clark himself had a fondness for the names of new western states and territories. He had even proposed renaming some of the Upper West Side avenues after western places, though the city rejected his suggestions. Whether the building's name originated from Clark's preferences or from the jokes about its remote location remains a matter of some debate among historians. There were practical reasons for skepticism beyond mere snobbery. The Upper West Side had almost no transportation connections to the rest of Manhattan. Walking to the business districts downtown would take well over an hour. Horse-drawn omnibuses were slow and unreliable. How would residents conduct their affairs? How would they maintain their social obligations? The 9th Avenue Elevated Railway had opened in 1879, providing the first direct transit link between the Upper West Side and Lower Manhattan. This development appears to have influenced Clark's thinking. With reliable transportation now available, the area's isolation seemed less permanent. The question was not whether the neighborhood would eventually develop, but who would be first to build for its future residents. Clark also understood something about the emerging American bourgeoisie. Not everyone who could afford luxury actually wanted the burden of maintaining a private mansion. According to contemporary accounts, he told the West Side Association in December of 1879 that few persons were princely enough to wish to occupy an entire palace. Many successful professionals would welcome the convenience of apartment living, provided the apartments were grand enough to satisfy their pride. His solution was to create something unlike anything New York had seen, not merely an apartment building, but a palace divided into private homes. Each residence would offer the space, the privacy, and the luxury of a mansion. But the burdens of maintenance, heating, and staffing would be shared. Residents could enjoy the benefits of wealth without its endless responsibilities. This was the gamble Clark made as he approached 70 years of age. The fortune from Singer sewing machines had made him one of the wealthiest men in America. He had no particular need to prove anything to anyone. When asked why he had chosen to become a real estate developer so late in life, his answer was characteristically direct. He wanted, he said, to make money. But there seemed to be something more driving him. Clark appeared determined to demonstrate that his vision of urban living was correct. He would construct his apartment palace in the wilderness. He would fill it with the finest materials and most modern conveniences available. And he would prove that the skeptics had underestimated both him and the future of the city he called home. Work began in late October of 1880. Clark hired the same architect who had designed the Van Courier. But where the earlier project had been a modest test, this new structure would be a statement. Clark instructed Hardenberg to spare no expense. The construction budget reached approximately $2 million. Individual apartments would cost roughly $25,000 each to build, more than 3 times what Clark had spent per unit at the Van Courier. The skeptics watched as the massive structure rose from the undeveloped lots of the Upper West Side. They continued to call it folly. They continued to predict failure. Edward Clark ignored them all. He had bet his reputation on an idea. Now he would see it through. Chapter 3. Hardenberg's Fortress. Henry Janeway. Hardenberg was 33 years old when Edward Clark asked him to design what would become the most famous apartment building in American history. The architect had already proven himself with the Van Courier. Now Clark wanted something far more ambitious, a structure that would silence every critic who doubted that wealthy New Yorkers could be persuaded to live in apartments. Hardenberg came from a family of Dutch descent in New Jersey. Born in 1847 in New Brunswick, he received his early education at the Hasbro Institute in Jersey City. Rather than attending a formal architecture school, he followed the traditional path of apprenticeship. From 1865 to 1870, he trained under Detlef Leonau, a German-born architect who had studied at the prestigious ALDA in Paris. This background would prove crucial. Leonau exposed his young apprentice to European design traditions that most American architects knew only from books. By 1870, Hardenberg had established his own practice in New York. His early commissions were modest: a chapel and library for Rutgers College, some residential projects in New Jersey. The Van Courier represented his first major opportunity. When that structure succeeded, Clark apparently saw no reason to look elsewhere for his grander vision. The design Hardenberg created for the Dakota defies easy classification. Architectural historians have argued about its style for well over a century. Some describe it as German Renaissance revival, pointing to the high gables, deep roofs, and robust ornamentation that recall the town halls of Northern Europe. Others see French influences, suggesting the design evokes the shadow architecture of the Francis I period. One critic writing decades later dismissed such neat categories entirely and called it brewery brick Victorian neo-Gothic eclectic. Perhaps the confusion is appropriate. Hardenberg seems to have drawn freely from multiple traditions, combining elements in ways that felt original rather than derivative. The result was unlike anything New York had seen. Massive in scale, imposing in presence, ornamented with such profusion of detail that the eye could wander across the facade for hours without exhausting its discoveries. The structure rises 8 stories above street level with an additional floor tucked beneath the steep rooflines. At the time of completion, this made it one of the taller residential structures in Manhattan. The exterior is composed primarily of buff-coaled brick trimmed with sandstone and decorated with terracotta panels. The roofline bristles with dormers, gables, and chimneys, creating a silhouette more reminiscent of a Hanseatic town hall than a New York residence. Hardenberg organized the structure around a central courtyard. The footprint is roughly square with the interior space forming an H shape when viewed from above. This arrangement served multiple practical purposes. The courtyard allowed natural light to reach apartments on all 4 sides. It provided ventilation in an era before air conditioning, and it offered residents a private outdoor space shielded from the noise and chaos of the city streets. The main entrance faces 72nd Street through a grand archway. This porte cochere measures approximately 16 feet wide and 20 feet tall, dimensions sufficient for horse-drawn carriages to pass through comfortably. Residents arriving home could be deposited directly in the courtyard, protected from weather and shielded from public view. The arrangement offered the kind of privacy that mansion dwellers expected, translated into the context of a shared structure. Above the entrance, architectural details proliferate. Terracotta panels, decorative ironwork, carved stonework. According to some accounts, portraits of a man and woman appear above the doorway, possibly depicting Isaac Singer and his wife Isabella, though this identification remains uncertain. A figure that appears to represent a Native American looks out from the roofline, perhaps a nod to the name and its associations with the Western Territories. Inside, Hardenberg planned 65 individual apartments. No two would be identical. This was a deliberate choice reflecting Clarke's understanding of his intended residence. Wealthy families moving from private mansions would expect their homes to feel unique, not like standardized units stamped from a common mold. The apartments range from 4 rooms to as many as 20, accommodating everything from modest households to sprawling family establishments with numerous servants. The internal circulation system reflected the rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age. 4 main staircases and 4 passenger elevators occupied the corners of the courtyard, providing access for residents. But servants used entirely separate routes. 4 additional service staircases and 4 service elevators, positioned at the midpoints of each courtyard side, led directly to the kitchens and back rooms. A resident might never encounter a delivery person or see a servant carrying groceries. The two worlds operated in parallel, sharing the same structure but rarely crossing paths. The courtyard itself was divided into 2 levels. The upper level at street grade served residents exclusively. Below it, accessible by ramps descending from both 72nd and 73rd Streets. A lower level handled all service functions. Delivery wagons could enter, unload their goods, and depart without ever appearing in the spaces reserved for the wealthy occupants. This separation addressed a criticism that had reportedly plagued the Vancoria, where grocers' carts and ice wagons cluttered the courtyard alongside residents' carriages. Construction employed several techniques considered innovative for the era. The foundation walls measured an estimated 3 to 4 feet thick, providing exceptional stability for a structure of this size. Rather than the newer steel frame methods then being developed, the Dakota used traditional load-bearing masonry with iron beams and concrete floors. Between the layers of flooring, workers reportedly packed mud taken from Central Park, a technique intended to provide both soundproofing and fire resistance. Hardenberg paid careful attention to the arrangement of rooms within each apartment. Following French precedent, he designed layouts where all major rooms connected to one another in sequence, a pattern called enfilade. But unlike pure French designs, he also provided corridor access to each room, allowing family members and guests to move about without passing through every space in between. Servants could reach any room through separate back passages without disturbing the household. Principal rooms faced outward toward the streets, dining rooms, kitchens, and secondary spaces oriented toward the courtyard. This arrangement ensured that the most important rooms received the best light and views, while functional spaces made do with the more modest interior exposures. Apartments on both sides of the structure thus received air and light from 2 directions, a relative novelty in Manhattan residential design at that time. The mechanical systems were remarkably advanced for their era. Clarke had specified that the Dakota should offer every modern convenience. Hardenberg delivered. The structure would have its own power plant, generating electricity at a time when much of Manhattan still relied on gas lighting. A central heating system would warm not just the Dakota itself, but potentially surrounding structures as well. Hydraulic elevators, still a relatively new technology, would carry residents to upper floors with previously unimaginable ease. To reassure nervous residents about safety, the power plant was positioned not within the main structure, but beneath a garden on the adjacent lot to the west. If the boilers exploded, as steam engines occasionally did in that era, the damage would not directly threaten the apartments. This placement reflected both practical engineering and psychological insight. Clark understood that his wealthy tenants would need reassurance before trusting their families to such novel arrangements. Hardenberg remained closely involved with his designs even after their completion. Years later, when a critic complained about service vehicles in the courtyard, the architect wrote a letter defending his design and explaining the separation of functions he had implemented. This attention to detail and ongoing concern for his work would characterize his entire career. The Dakota would not be Hardenberg's last major project. In subsequent decades, he would design the Plaza Hotel at 5th Avenue and 59th Street, completed in 1907. He also created the original Waldorf Astoria on 5th Avenue, later demolished to make way for the Empire State Building. But many architectural historians consider the Dakota his finest achievement, the project where he first demonstrated on a grand scale that apartment living could satisfy the most demanding American tastes. Construction progressed through 1881 and 1882. The massive structure gradually took shape on the undeveloped lots of the Upper West Side. New Yorkers watched with fascination and skepticism as Clark's vision became reality. But Edward Clark would not live to see his project completed. Edward Clark understood that convincing wealthy New Yorkers to abandon their townhouse would require more than architectural grandeur. The Dakota needed to offer a way of life. Every comfort of mansion living, delivered without the burden of managing it yourself. From the moment a resident stepped through the porte cochere, everything should feel effortless, gracious, complete. The interiors reflected this ambition. Craftsmen spent months on details that most visitors would never consciously notice. Ceilings of hand-carved oak, each panel shaped by skilled woodworkers. Floors inlaid with patterns of marble, mahogany, oak, and cherry. Fireplaces with hand-carved marble mantels. Reportedly no two alike in the entire structure. Door frames and moldings that spoke of old European craftsmanship transplanted to the New World. For his own apartment, Clark allegedly went further still. According to accounts that have circulated for decades, he specified floors inlaid with sterling silver. Whether this extraordinary detail was ever actually installed remains a matter of some debate. Clark died before the Dakota opened, and his apartment passed to other occupants. But the story persists, a testament to the extravagance that characterized the entire project. The individual apartments offered prospective tenants something no New York residents had provided before, customization on a grand scale. Clark apparently encouraged buyers to modify their units according to personal taste. Walls could be moved, rooms combined or divided. The result was that the 65 apartments already designed to be unique became even more individualized as their first occupants shaped them to particular needs. But the Dakota's most revolutionary feature was not any single apartment. It was the services that would surround them. On the ground floor, Clark created a dining establishment designed to rival the finest restaurants in the city. Contemporary descriptions suggest the main dining room was finished in the manner of an English baronial hall. Marble floors, walls panelled in carved English oak, bronze bas relief work on the upper walls, ceilings of quartered oak intricately carved. A massive Scottish brownstone fireplace dominated the centre of the space. Adjacent rooms provided a ladies' dining area and chambers for dinner parties. Residents who preferred to eat in their own apartments could do so with remarkable ease. A network of dumb waiters connected the dining facilities to individual kitchens throughout the structure. Meals prepared by professional staff could be delivered hot and fresh, ready to be served by a family's own servants. The arrangement would offer the convenience of hotel living with the privacy of a home. The staff required to maintain this operation would be enormous by any standard. Clark planned for approximately 150 employees to work within the walls. Elevator operators and doormen were merely the visible few. Behind the scenes would labor a resident housekeeper supervising a team of maids. A lairess would manage her own staff in dedicated facilities. There was to be a gentleman's tailor in the basement, a house carpenter, 2 house painters, a cabinet maker, an electrician, a plumber, a glazier. The Dakota would function less like an apartment house and more like a self-contained village. Laundry service exemplified the level of care planned. Staff would collect soiled items from each apartment in special wicker baskets. The garments would return washed, ironed, and mended with buttons replaced and tears repaired. Each piece was to be separated with sheets of pink tissue paper according to later accounts of the service. For families accustomed to managing their own household staff, this represented an extraordinary reduction in daily concerns. The upper floors would house the army of servants who made this lifestyle possible. The 8th floor contained quarters for personal servants employed by individual families, as well as communal dormitories for male and female staff with shared bathrooms. The 9th floor held laundry facilities with drying areas extending onto the roof. These spaces were functional rather than elegant, a hidden world designed to support the gracious living below. Even the roof offered amenities. Children's play areas occupied portions of the upper level, providing safe outdoor space for young residents. Parents could allow their children to play without concern for street traffic or the dangers of an unfinished neighborhood. Some contemporary accounts mention promenades with gazeos and canopied sunshades offering views across Central Park and the developing city beyond. On the adjacent western lot above the mechanical plant, Clark planned recreational grounds. Tennis courts and croquet lawns would give residents access to fashionable outdoor pursuits without leaving home. Gardens would provide green space in a neighborhood that still lacked public amenities. The arrangement meant that families could enjoy many of the pleasures of a country estate while living at the center of Manhattan. The heating system deserves particular mention. Steam radiators would warm every apartment from a central source, eliminating the need for individual furnaces and the staff to maintain them. Residents would never need to worry about ordering coal, managing boilers, or dealing with the soot and ash that plagued individual homes. The entire burden of keeping warm through New York winters would simply vanish. All of this came with staff dedicated to anticipating problems before residents even noticed them. The bronze fixtures would be polished regularly, the mahogany oiled, the brass rubbed, the floors waxed. Clark envisioned a level of maintenance that would preserve the Dakota's grandeur for generations. What Clark planned was not merely an apartment house, it was a machine for gracious living. Every inconvenience of home ownership had been considered and eliminated. The burden of finding reliable servants, managing household repairs, coordinating deliveries, maintaining grounds and equipment, all of it would vanish into the capable hands of professional staff. Residents would pay their rent and live like aristocrats. For families weighing the decision to leave their townhouses, the Dakota offered a compelling argument. The same money that barely maintained an individual home in fashionable Manhattan could provide access to services that even the wealthiest households struggled to match. The Dakota promised not a diminished life, but an enhanced one. Less responsibility, more comfort, the pleasures of wealth without its endless obligations. This was Clark's vision made tangible, not simply a place to live, but a way of living that had never before existed in America. A palace divided into homes where the palace itself took care of everything. Now all he needed was tenants willing to believe him, and time enough to see his vision completed. Edward Clark never walked through the finished Dakota. In the autumn of 1882, as workers swarmed over the rising structure at 72nd Street, Clark fell ill at his country estate in Coopertown. He was 70 years old, had accumulated one of the great American fortunes, and had spent the past 2 years watching his most ambitious project take shape. The walls had reached their full height. The distinctive gables and dormers were being fitted. From upstate New York, he could picture the completed building, the tenants who would fill it, the vindication of every skeptic who had laughed at his wilderness apartment house. He would not live to see any of it. Edward Clark died of malarial fever on October 14, 1882. The Dakota was roughly 2 years from completion. The man who had conceived it, financed it, and defended it against ridicule would never stand in its courtyard, never dine in its baronial hall, never occupy the lavish apartment he had planned for himself. His obituaries focused on the Singer Manufacturing Company, on the fortune he had built, on the legal brilliance that had made it possible. The strange apartment house rising on the Upper West Side received mention as an eccentricity, a footnote to a more conventional success story. Clark's estate was valued at approximately $25 million, with some estimates running as high as $50 million. This staggering sum, equivalent to well over $500 million today, reflected decades of careful investment and his dominant stake in Singer. His will distributed portions to various family members, but the bulk of his real estate holdings, including the unfinished Dakota, passed to his grandson, Edward Seaver Clark. The boy was just 12 years old. This created an immediate problem. A child could not manage a fortune, let alone oversee the completion of the most ambitious residential building in New York history. Trustees stepped in to handle the estate during Edward Seaver's minority. These men, presumably selected by Clark himself, would guide the Dakota to completion according to the original plans. Whatever adjustments or economies might have tempted lesser stewards, the trustees appear to have honored the founders' intentions in full. Construction continued through the winter of 1882 and into 1883. Henry Hardenberg remained as architect, supervising the finishing work that would transform a shell into a residence. In August of 1883, plasterers went on strike to protest the employment of non-UN laborers, and other tradesmen briefly joined them. But within a month, work resumed. Craftsmen completed the interior details that had been specified so carefully. The mechanical systems were fitted into place. Workers laid the intricate floor patterns, hung the heavy doors, and prepared every surface for the residents who would soon arrive. The neighborhood around the Dakota was changing as well. The building's presence had announced that the Upper West Side was open for development. Other investors, emboldened by Clark's gamble, began their own projects. Streets that had been empty lots in 1880 were showing signs of life. By 1884, the elevated railway brought more traffic. Shops and services began to appear. The Dakota would not stand quite so alone as its creator had originally feared. By September of 1884, the real estate record reported that the Dakota would be ready for occupancy on October 1st, with yearly rents ranging from $1,500 to $5,000. But here was the remarkable thing. 1/4 of the units had already been rented. By the time the building officially opened in late October, every single apartment was spoken for. Not a vacancy remained. The Dakota was completed by the final week of October 1884, approximately 4 years after construction had begun. Whatever doubts fashionable New Yorkers had harbored about living so far uptown, whatever concerns they had expressed about apartment life itself, the finished product answered most objections. This was no tenement. This was not even the respectable but modest middle-class experiment that had preceded it. This was something genuinely new, and New York's wealthy had recognized it before the doors even opened. The first tenants represented exactly the class Clark had hoped to attract: lawyers, brokers, merchants, and clothingers, a cigar merchant, a coal mine operator, even a stenographer. They were prosperous, but not particularly famous. None appeared on the 400, that exclusive list of New York society's inner circle. The Dakota's remoteness still posed challenges. In an age before telephones became common, social visits required travel, and reaching the building from the Ladies' Mile shopping district could take an hour. But the tenants came nonetheless, drawn by what Clark had built. Reports from those early months suggest that the Dakota delivered on its promises. The systems functioned. The services materialized as advertised. Residents found themselves freed from the demands that had made home ownership so exhausting. They could focus on their lives, their work, their social obligations, while the building itself handled everything else. Critics who had dismissed the project as folly were forced to reconsider. The New York Daily Graphic declared it one of the most perfect apartment houses in the world. The real estate record praised both the architect and his client. What had seemed like madness in 1880 had become shrewd judgment by 1885. But Edward Clarke himself had become a kind of ghost in his own creation. His portrait hung somewhere within those walls, a reminder of the man whose foresight had made it possible. Residents who had never met him walked through spaces he had designed. They enjoyed comforts he had planned. They lived the life he had conceived for them, and they did so without ever knowing quite how much courage it had taken to build such a thing in such a place at such a time. The Dakota had proven the doubters wrong. Prosperous New Yorkers would live in apartments. They would accept neighbors on the other side of their walls. They would ride elevators and eat in communal dining rooms and entrust their daily comfort to a trained staff. All it had taken was a building grand enough to make such arrangements feel like privileges rather than compromises. Edward Severin Clarke, the 12-year-old heir, would eventually come into his inheritance. He would grow up to become owner of the most prestigious residential building in Manhattan. The Dakota would generate income for decades, funding a comfortable life for generations of Clarks. His grandfather's gamble had paid off spectacularly, but the old man himself had missed the vindication. He had died believing in something that did not yet exist, trusting that others would complete what he had started. In that sense, Edward Clarke was perhaps the truest kind of builder. He had seen clearly enough to begin and trusted deeply enough to let go. The Dakota rose above 72nd Street exactly as he had planned it, and somewhere in those first months of operation, as tenants settled into their new lives and staff hurried through the corridors and the great building hummed with activity, Edward Clarke's dream became simply reality. A place where people lived, a New York landmark, a testament to one man's refusal to accept the limits of his time. Yet he had built something that would outlast him by more than a century. Perhaps that was vindication enough. For 77 years, the Dakota belonged to one family. Edward Cat Clarke had bequeathed the unfinished building to his eldest grandson, Edward Severin Clarke, who was just 12 years old when he inherited it. Trustees managed the property during the boy's minority, guiding it through its first years of operation. By the time Edward Seaver reached adulthood in the early 1890s and assumed direct control, the Dakota had already established itself as precisely what his grandfather had envisioned. The skeptics had been silenced. A waiting list had formed. The Upper West Side was no longer wilderness, but an increasingly fashionable district. Edward Seaver proved to be a steady custodian. He was the eldest of 4 brothers, the others being Frederick Ambrose, Robert Sterling, and Stephen Carleton, all heirs to the vast Singer fortune their grandfather had accumulated. None of them needed the Dakota's rental income to survive. The sewing machine company continued to dominate its industry, throwing off dividends that dwarfed whatever the apartment house might produce. This financial independence shaped everything about how the Clarks managed their grandfather's creation. Rents remained surprisingly modest. Increases came slowly, if at all. Long-term tenants found their rates held steady for decades, a generosity that would have been impossible for a landlord who depended on the property for income. The Dakota functioned less as a commercial investment than as a kind of family legacy, maintained out of pride rather than necessity. The results were remarkable. Between 1884 and 1929, the building never had a single vacancy. 45 years of continuous full occupancy. Families arrived and stayed for generations. Children grew up within those walls, sometimes taking apartments of their own when they married. The Dakota developed the intimate character of a village, its residents bound by the peculiar experience of sharing such an extraordinary address. Among the early distinguished tenants were members of the Steinway family, whose pianos had become synonymous with musical excellence. Their presence established a pattern that would persist for decades. The Dakota attracted not merely wealth, but culture. People who valued art and creativity alongside material success. Edward Severin Clarke died on September 19th, 1933, just weeks before the building's 50th anniversary. He left no children. At the time of his death, 2 tenants had lived in the Dakota since its very first days of operation in 1884. 4 other original residents had passed away in the preceding 3 years. The building was becoming a monument to continuity, its history measured in lifetimes. Ownership passed to Edward Seaver's youngest brother, Stephen Carlton Clark. Stephen was a man of remarkable accomplishments beyond the family business. He had been a founding trustee of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929 and served as chairman of its board through the 1940s. In 1939, he established the Baseball Hall of Fame in Coopertown, the family's ancestral home in upstate New York. He collected paintings by Rembrandt, Matisse, Degas, and Picasso. He approached everything with the same methodical intelligence that had characterized his grandfather's management of the Singer Empire. Stephen intended to continue operating the Dakota exactly as his brother had, preserving both the structure and the gardens to its west. For nearly 3 decades under his stewardship, little changed. The building even retained its original elevators, the same hydraulic machines that had astonished visitors in 1884. The Clarks handled all repairs and maintenance themselves, answerable to no outside authority. But time was working its slow transformations nonetheless. As the 20th century progressed, the elaborate services that had once defined Dakota living began to disappear. The laundry service went first, along with the tailoring and the resident housekeeper and her staff of maids. These amenities had always been expensive to maintain, and the social patterns that had made them desirable were changing. Families who had once relied entirely on the building staff learned to make other arrangements. Shortly after the Second World War, the dining room closed permanently. It had never operated at a profit. Edward Cat Clark had conceived it as an inducement, a convenience to help wealthy families transition from private homes. But by the late 1940s, tenants preferred their own kitchens or the city's restaurants. The elaborate basement operation fell silent. By the 1950s, the servants' quarters on the upper floors had been converted into apartments. The staff that remained, 45 people by 1960, down from the original 150, no longer needed dormitories. The hidden world that had once supported gracious living had contracted to a fraction of its former scale. The tenant population was shifting too. Many residents by mid-century were diplomats, theatrical figures, or publishers. The building particularly appealed to people in the entertainment industry because of its proximity to the Broadway theater district on the west side. The Dakota was becoming known as a haven for creative personalities, a reputation it would carry into the decades ahead. Stephen Clark himself never lived in the building. He maintained a townhouse across the park on East 71st Street. As he entered his late 70s, the Dakota's residents grew anxious about the future. They invited him to dinners, sent birthday greetings, offered thoughtful Christmas gifts. Everyone wanted some hint of what would happen when the inevitable occurred. Clark gave no indication of his plans. He was absorbed in his art collection, his philanthropic work, his responsibilities to the institutions he had helped create. The Dakota was simply one asset among many. Stephen Carlton Clark died on September 17, 1960. He was 78 years old. When his will was read, the news troubled the residents deeply. Clark had not left the Dakota to his children or grandchildren. He had bequeathed it to the Clark Foundation, the charitable organization he had established in 1931 to support causes in Coopertown. At first, this seemed acceptable. A foundation might prove a stable owner, less likely to make dramatic changes than an individual heir might be. But the tenants soon discovered a devastating legal reality. Under New York state law, a charitable foundation could not hold property that failed to generate profit. And the Dakota, for all its prestige, had never truly been profitable. The Clarks had kept rents artificially low, had maintained services beyond what income justified, had treated the building as a legacy rather than an investment. Under the foundation's ownership, this arrangement could not continue. By January of 1961, the foundation had accepted an offer of $4.5 million from a developer who planned to demolish the building and replace it with a modern apartment tower. 77 years of family stewardship were about to end. The Dakota itself might cease to exist unless the tenants could find a way to save it. On the afternoon of Friday, December 17, 1960, Ernest A. Gross was sitting in his Wall Street office when the telephone rang. The caller was William Zehndorf, the unquestioned czar of New York real estate. "I want to introduce myself," Zehndorf said. "I'm your new landlord." Gross was one of the Dakota's most distinguished residents, an international lawyer who had served 3 times as a delegate to the United Nations. He understood immediately what Zehndorf's words implied. Whenever the developer acquired an old building on a choice piece of land, he razed it and erected a tower of steel and glass in its place. "Buildings like the Dakota don't make sense in New York anymore," Zehndorf told him. It had been barely 3 months since Stephen Clark's death. The Clark Foundation had moved quickly to divest itself of the unprofitable property. Zehndorf claimed to have made an offer of $4.5 million that afternoon, with a deadline of noon on Monday. The foundation had indicated willingness to accept. The Dakota's residents had 2.5 days over a weekend to find some way to save their home. Gross immediately contacted his neighbor Charles Douglas Jackson. C.D. Jackson, as everyone called him, was a vice president of Time Incorporated, but his background ran deeper than magazine publishing. During the Second World War, he had served as deputy chief of the Psychological Warfare Division for the Allied Forces. Later, he had worked as a special assistant to President Eisenhower. If anyone knew how to mobilize resources under pressure, it was C.D. Jackson. The two men hastily called a meeting of the Dakota's tenants. The gathering convened in the old dining room. What unfolded there was pandemonium. Elderly tenants who had lived in the building for half a century confronted the prospect of eviction. The marble floors echoed with shouting, cursing, stamping, and sobbing. Judy Holliday was there, the actress who had won an Academy Award for Born yesterday. She sat weeping. Recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, she wanted only to die in the building she considered home. Miss E. Bruce. Leo appeared in a picture hat and trailing gown. She had not set foot outside her 18-room apartment in years. Some said she was 102 years old. "I will not be put out of my house," she kept shouting. "I will not be put out." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Gross and Jackson retreated to the Jackson apartment for drinks and to consider whether the Dakota could be saved at all. In the weeks that followed, the situation shifted. Zehndorf's bid did not succeed. Instead, in January of 1961, a different developer, the Glickman Corporation, purchased the Dakota and an adjoining lot for $4.6 million. Louis Glickman intended to demolish the building and construct what he boasted would be New York City's largest apartment tower. But the Dakota's residents were not without resources. Many were wealthy. More importantly, many were connected to media, to finance, to power. Through the winter and early spring, the tenants organized. They formed a cooperative corporation. They negotiated with Glickman, appealing to whatever combination of sentiment, publicity, and financial pressure might persuade him to sell rather than demolish. In April of 1961, they announced an agreement to purchase the Dakota for $4.8 million, $200,000 more than Glickman had paid just months earlier. Glickman would keep the adjoining lot and sell it separately. The deal required substantial sums from the tenants. Those who wished to remain would buy shares in the cooperative, converting from renters to owners. Many long-term residents, who had paid artificially low rents for decades under the Clarks, now faced monthly charges that exceeded their old payments significantly. Not everyone could afford the transition. An enclave of former servants of the Portuguese consul who had remained on the 8th floor, paying no rent even after their employer departed for Lisbon years earlier, faced an impossible situation. The economics of cooperative ownership had no room for such arrangements. but most residents found ways to stay. In November of 1961, the transaction was completed. The Dakota's tenants officially became its owners. For the first time in its history, the people who lived in the Dakota controlled its fate. The Glickman Corporation sold the adjacent lot that August. A bland apartment tower called the Mayfair rose on the site where gardens had once served the Dakota's residents. It was the kind of building that might have replaced the Dakota itself. Efficient, modern, utterly forgettable. The new cooperative faced immediate challenges. Under the Clarks, all maintenance and repairs had been funded from seemingly bottomless family resources. Now those costs fell to the residents. The building had aged gracefully, but not always carefully. The original elevators, still operating after nearly 80 years, needed attention. In 1974, the co-op board undertook major repairs. The cost came to $500,000, approximately $5,000 per apartment. The residents paid it. They had saved the Dakota once. They would maintain it now. The conversion brought other changes. Under the Clarks, tenants came and went based on personal relationships and quiet understandings. The new cooperative required formal structure. A board of directors would govern the building. Prospective residents would need approval. Rules would be established. This formalization would eventually make the Dakota famous for the selectivity of its admissions process. But in 1961, such concerns lay in the future. What mattered was simpler. The building still stood. The tenants still lived there. The wrecking ball had been turned away. Edward Clark's creation, threatened with extinction, had been preserved by the very people for whom he had built it. In 1967, Roman Polanski came to New York searching for the perfect building to appear in his new horror film. Ira Levin's novel Rosemary's Baby had been published earlier that year and was climbing the bestseller lists. The story followed a young couple who move into a brooding Manhattan apartment building called the Bramford, where their seemingly harmless elderly neighbors turn out to be members of a satanic cult. Paramount Pictures had acquired the rights, and the young Polish director, fresh from the psychological horror of repulsion, had been hired to adapt and direct. The Bramford needed to feel real. Polanski wanted exteriors that would establish the building as a character in its own right, a place where dark secrets seemed not merely possible, but inevitable. He needed something old and ornate, vaguely sinister, something that looked as though it might harbor witches. He found the Dakota. Levin had drawn inspiration from several old Manhattan apartment buildings when creating the Bramford. He even included a knowing wink in the novel. When the character Hutch tries to dissuade Rosemary from moving into the ominous Bramford, he suggests she consider the Dakota instead. Now Polanski would collapse that distinction. The fictional Bramford and the real Dakota would share a face. Principal photography began on August 21, 1967. Polanski shot exterior scenes at 72nd Street, capturing the gabled roofline, the ornate facade, the silhouette against the sky. The Dakota's management refused to allow filming inside, so all interior scenes were constructed on sound stages at Paramount Studios in Hollywood. But the exteriors were everything Polanski needed. The arched entrance where Rosemary and Guy arrived to view their apartment, the courtyard glimpsed through the passage, the mass of the structure looming overhead. The Dakota gave the film its visual foundation, establishing from the opening aerial shot that this was a place where something was wrong. Mia Farrow starred as Rosemary Woodhouse, the young wife who realizes that her neighbors have sinister plans for her unborn child. John Cavdees played her ambitious husband, Guy. Ruth Gordon portrayed the mealsome neighbor, Minnie Castet, with such brilliance that she would win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The production was difficult. Polanski's perfectionism drove costs $400,000 over budget. He demanded dozens of takes for single shots. Midway through filming, Frank Sinatra, Farrow's husband, served her with divorce papers on set, delivered by a lawyer in front of the cast and crew. One scene became legendary. When Farrow hesitated to film a sequence showing Rosemary wandering into Fifth Avenue traffic, Polanski pointed to her pregnancy padding and assured her that no one would hit a pregnant woman. He then followed her into the street himself, operating a handheld camera because no one else would do it. Rosemary's Baby opened on June 12, 1968. Critics praised Polanski's craftsmanship and Farrow's vulnerable performance. Audiences responded to the slow-building dread so different from the monsters that typically defined horror. The picture earned over $30 million, an enormous sum for its time. The Dakota had become famous in an entirely new way. For decades, the building had been known as an address of wealth and distinction. Now it was also the Bramford, a place of conspiracy and nightmare. The film introduced the Dakota to millions who would never see its interior or meet its residents. They knew it as a backdrop for horror. The association proved durable. Rosemary's Baby entered the canon of American film and was eventually selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. Through sequels and remakes, the Dakota remained its visual anchor. Some residents found the connection uncomfortable. They had not purchased apartments in a haunted house. But the Dakota had always possessed a certain theatrical quality. Those ornate gables, that massive presence. Polanski had simply recognized what was already there. The building looked like a place where extraordinary things might happen. He had merely suggested what kind. The Dakota's image had become cultural currency, rich with associations, both real and fictional. It remained one of Manhattan's finest addresses, but it was now also a screen onto which audiences projected their fears. Within a decade, those fears would take on a terrible reality. The Dakota had attracted artists from the very beginning. The composer Poch Tchaikovsky visited during his American tour in 1891. He dined in the building and marveled at its amenities. Other distinguished guests followed over the decades, drawn by residents who moved in artistic and intellectual circles. Piano manufacturers lived alongside patrons of the opera and supporters of the symphony. For nearly 50 years, the Dakota remained a haven for prosperous families of a particular cultural bent. The building developed a character distinct from the purely social addresses of Fifth Avenue. It was respectable without being stuffy, elegant without being rigid. Then in the middle of the 20th century, the actors began to arrive. Boris Karloff was among the first. The British actor had achieved international fame in 1931 as the monster in Frankenstein, a role that would define his career. By the 1950s, he had moved to New York to pursue stage work and taken an apartment in the Dakota with his wife, Evelyn. Some residents reportedly objected. Having a performer in the building they feared might lower its tone. Actors were not quite respectable. They worked odd hours, kept unusual company, attracted unwanted attention. The Dakota had always been discreet. Their fears proved unfounded. Karloff was a gentleman, soft-spoken, cultured, devoted to his craft. He lived quietly for years, pursuing work that ranged from Broadway to television to radio. He narrated the animated special How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 1966, winning a Grammy Award. He remained in the building until his death in 1969. More importantly, Karloff opened the door. If the man who played Frankenstein's monster could live respectably at 72nd Street, so could other performers. In the decades that followed, actors and musicians would find their way to the Dakota in increasing numbers. Lillian Gish took an apartment. The legendary star of silent cinema had worked with D.W. Griffith in the earliest days of American film. She had survived the transition to sound and continued working into her 90s. She brought with her the history of an entire art form. Judy Garland lived briefly in the building during the 1960s. By then, the star of The Wizard of Oz was struggling with the personal demons that would claim her life in 1969. Her time at the Dakota was short and troubled, but her presence added another layer to the building's legend. Lauren Beale arrived in 1961, the same year the tenants organized to save the building from demolition. She purchased a sprawling 9-room apartment for $68,000, a substantial sum then, a fraction of what it would later be worth. But Call had been a Hollywood star since the 1940s, famous for her sultry voice and her marriage to Humphrey Bogart. After Bogart's death, she had rebuilt her life around Broadway. She would live in the Dakota for 53 years until her death in 2014. She became one of the building's fixtures, a living connection to Hollywood's golden age. When residents gathered for the annual Christmas party, Beale contributed elaborate homemade desserts. Leonard Bernstein moved into a second-floor apartment with sweeping views of Central Park. The composer and conductor was at the height of his fame, having created West Side Story and led the New York Philharmonic to international acclaim. His apartment became a gathering place for musicians and intellectuals. The Dakota's construction, those massive walls designed for privacy and quiet, allowed him to work at his piano without disturbing neighbors. The pattern was clear. The Dakota attracted creative people. Something about the building appealed to artists. Perhaps it was the apartments themselves, vast spaces with soaring ceilings and rooms that flowed into one another, spaces that could accommodate a grand piano or a painter's studio. Perhaps it was the building's character, that sense of a world apart from ordinary Manhattan. Perhaps it was simply tradition. The economics helped as well. Under the Clarks' long ownership, rents had remained modest. Even after the cooperative conversion, the Dakota offered grandeur on terms that creative careers could sustain. By the late 1960s, the building had become known as a haven for exactly the kind of people its original residents had feared: performers, musicians, writers, celebrities of every description. The address that had once attracted industrialists now attracted artists. Among the residents in 1973 was the actor Robert Ryan, a craggy character actor known for films like The Dirty Dozen. Ryan was dying of cancer that year. His apartment on the 7th floor would soon become available. A young English musician and his Japanese-American wife were looking for a place to live. They had heard about the Dakota. They wondered if they might sublet Robert Ryan's apartment. Their names were John Lennon and Yoko Ono. In the spring of 1973, a former Beatle and his avant-garde wife were looking for a new home in Manhattan. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had been living in the West Village, but they wanted something grander, something with history. Their assistant made inquiries at the Dakota. As it happened, the actor Robert Ryan was preparing to vacate Unit 72 on the 7th floor. His wife had recently died, and he could no longer bear to remain in the space they had shared. Ryan himself would die of lung cancer within months. A single viewing was all it took. The place ran half the length of a city block, 4 bedrooms, stunning views across Central Park's treetops with a distant glimpse of the lake beyond. But what truly captivated John was the feel of it. Heavy brass light switches, sit-down elevators operated by attendants in uniform, mahogany and oak and cherrywood paneling throughout. It reminded him of Victorian Liverpool, the world of his childhood. The co-op board was not immediately enthusiastic. Some residents feared the couple would host loud parties with amplifiers. There had been drug-related charges in England, but the Lennons proved the skeptics wrong. Once installed, they kept almost entirely to themselves. They gave no parties. They sought absolute privacy. This did not make them invisible. When the couple emerged, they were impossible to miss. John favored blue jeans paired with a long black cape and a wide-brimmed sombrero, sometimes sucking on a pacifier. Yoko accompanied him in dramatic heads that changed weekly. They would step into matching silver limousines and glide away into the city. Devoted fans knew exactly where to find them. Despite security guards and the gated entrance, admirers sometimes slipped inside and roamed the corridors, ringing doorbells, searching for their hero. Lauren Beale was known to scold the loiterers when she came and went. This made some of them cry, which upset John. He loved his fans even when they invaded his privacy. The Lennons eventually owned 5 units in the Dakota. two for storage, one as a studio, two for guests. Yoko established her business offices in a ground floor space called Studio One, from which she managed their considerable affairs. On October 9th, 1975, everything changed. That day was John's 35th birthday. It was also the day his son Shotaro Ono Lennon was born. John had an older son, Julian, from his first marriage, but that relationship had suffered during the years when Beatlemania consumed his life. He carried guilt about this. When Sean arrived, he made a decision. He retired from music. For the next 5 years, John Lennon became a house husband. While Yoko spent her days downstairs negotiating deals and managing investments, John stayed upstairs with Sean. He baked bread. He supervised the nanny. He sang his son to sleep. He watched the seasons change over Central Park. His guitar hung on a nail above the bed, untouched for months at a time. His neighbors came to know a different man than the one who had screamed through stadium tours. They encountered a quiet father pushing a stroller through the courtyard, a polite eccentric who appeared at the annual potluck dinner on the first Wednesday of October, bringing macrobiotic dishes. Roberta Flack lived next door. The Grammy-winning singer had moved in during the early 70s, becoming the Dakota's first African-American resident. She and the Lennons were friendly, though she later observed that most artists in the place tended to keep to themselves. Sean would eventually call her Aunt Roberta. In July 1976, John finally received his green card after years of legal battles. He was free to leave America and return at will. In 1978, he and Yoko purchased a 600-acre dairy farm in upstate New York. John bought a herd of 122 Holstein cows. He seemed to be building a life as far from rock stardom as possible. By the summer of 1980, Sean was approaching his FTH birthday. John had been away from recording for half a decade. Then something shifted. In June, he traveled to Bermuda with an acoustic guitar. Alone with his thoughts, he began writing again. The songs came in a flood. Woman, beautiful boy, watching the wheels, starting over. He called Yoko, playing the new compositions over the phone. She had been writing, too. They decided to make a record together, alternating tracks, a dialogue between husband and wife. John returned, transformed. He booked time at the Hit Factory studio. He assembled a band. In August 1980, for the first time in 5 years, he went back to work. The album would be called Double Fantasy. It was released on November 17th. Reviews were mixed, but sales were strong. John gave interviews for the first time in years, speaking openly about his retreat and his joy at returning. He seemed happy. He spoke of more records. He spoke of touring. He spoke of the future. 3 weeks after the release on December 8th, John and Yoko spent the afternoon at the record plant working on a track of hers called Walking on Thin Ice. John added a guitar part that crackled with energy. When they finished, he turned to his wife. "Yoko," he said, "I think you just cut your first #1. They left the studio and headed home. Sean would be waiting. It was almost his bedtime. If you stand at the windows of the Dakota and look across Central Park West, you can see a teardrop-shaped clearing in the trees. This is Strawberry Fields, the memorial that Yoko Ono created for her husband. It did not exist when John was alive. The patch of land at 72nd Street was an unremarkable section of Central Park, isolated between roadways and showing signs of decay like much of the park in those years. But it happened to be where John and Yoko took their daily walks. They would cross the street from the Dakota, enter the park, and wander the paths together for hours. 10 days after the murder, on December 18, 1980, City Council member Henry Stern introduced legislation to rename this section of the park. On March 26, 1981, the designation became official. The tear-shaped knoll would be called Strawberry Fields after the Beatles song John had written in 1966. The song itself was named for a place in Liverpool. Strawberry Field was a Salvation Army children's home near the house where John grew up. As a boy, he would sneak into the grounds to play with the orphans. His Aunt Mimi disapproved, but John kept going. Years later, he transformed those memories into one of the Beatles' most surreal and beautiful recordings. Yoko wanted to transform the New York site into something equally meaningful. In an open letter published in the New York Times in 1981, she invited countries from around the world to contribute plants and stones for what she called a garden of peace. She did not want a statue. John would not have wanted a statue. He would have wanted something alive. It would be nice to have the whole world in one place, she wrote. One field living and growing together in harmony. The response was extraordinary. More than 120 countries sent donations. An oak tree from Great Britain, dogwoods from Monaco, tulip bulbs from the Netherlands, maples from Canada, strawberry plants, of course, from the Central Park Conservancy itself. Yoko contributed $1 million to the project. Half went to the redesign and landscaping, half went into an endowment for perpetual maintenance. She worked closely with Bruce Kelly, the chief landscape architect for the Central Park Conservancy, to create something that would feel both peaceful and alive. Kelly designed a series of meandering paths through small meadows lined with trees and shrubs. The landscape was meant to integrate with the original vision of Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park more than a century earlier. This was not a monument imposed upon the park. It was a restoration of what the park was meant to be. At the western point of the garden, Kelly and Ono placed a focal element. Artisans from Naples, Italy, crafted a circular mosaic of black and white stones in a starburst pattern. At its center was a single word, imagine. The mosaic referenced Jay's most famous solo song, the one he had recorded in 1971. But Yoko later revealed that much of the song's concept had come from her own artwork and writings. The word belonged to both of them. On October 9, 1985, Strawberry Fields was dedicated. The date was John's birthday. He would have been 45 years old. It was also Shah's 10th birthday. Yoko stood before several hundred guests with her arm around her son. Mayor Edward Coe joined her on the small stage. Roberta Flack was there. So was the actor Michael Douglas and dozens of United Nations officials representing the countries that had contributed to the garden. This garden is the result of all of us dreaming together, Yoko told the crowd. She borrowed a line from the Beatles.